Good evening and welcome to episode 278 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Kumalo. It's a Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the only daily property talk show in South Africa that helps you on your property journey. To all our regular viewers, welcome back. You know how we do it every single weekday. You and I have an appointment at 7 p.m. where I'm always in conversation with a property expert who helps us navigate our property journey. Doesn't matter whether you're a tenant, a landlord, you're looking to buy, to sell, or to build. This is the show that will make sure that you have all the right knowledge to help you along the way. And talking about helping you along the way, we of course have a whole host of other great shows across the private property social media pages that also help you on your property journey. As it is a Tuesday this evening, you can catch award-winning farmer Umbali Nwoko on the Farming Podcast, bringing you all things agriculture. And of course, one of the things I'm very excited about that show is getting to learn different ways, not just of how obviously the agricultural landscape and value chain works, but also how we at home can be more conscious of how, our food is produced and the journey that our food goes through before it lands on our plate. And you can catch that show every single weekday at 8 p.m. Sorry, not every weekday, every Tuesdays and Thursdays rather at 8 p.m. And this evening, she's going to be looking at online poultry supply. A lot of us certainly eat a lot of chicken. Well, you're going to have to get a sense of how it works when it comes to being supplied online. And every Wednesdays, Esther Clanston brings the first time home buyers show, which is always in conversation with people who've not only walked that first time home buying journey, but have gone on to grow their property portfolio portfolio from strength to strength. So if you know anybody who has a really impressive property portfolio that you'd like Esty to have a sit down with, then do reach out to us so that she can be in a conversation with them. And every Mondays and Fridays, Chad takes us through very exclusive properties across the country that you can find on www.privateproperty.co.za. So do make sure that you plug in to our social media our social media platforms, and of course, all our shows across our social media platforms, whether it is on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. Of course, we're now even on TikTok. Do follow us there. You can follow myself at @Zamantungwa_K on Instagram as well as on Twitter, talking all things relating to property. Well, getting started on our conversation this evening, as I like marking the register, I want to see who is in attendance, who is watching us, have a very exciting guest. I've been looking forward to this conversation since last week. And this evening, we're looking at the future of green building developments. And I'm sure a lot of you probably wondering, what are green building developments? Why is it even important for us to, make sure that a lot of the developments that we see, particularly from the commercial space, are green? We even have, the Green Building Council in South Africa. We're going to be exploring how South Africa fares with some of our international counterparts. And I think one of the things that we're also going to explore with my guests, and I was saying to her off air, I'm particularly going to have us raise this because it's something that she's embarked on, and we're having this conversation last week, is around how we can use, sort of green principles in some of our residential projects, particularly in township property, especially for those of, you at home who are probably property entrepreneurs within the township space, and perhaps there are some green elements, some green building elements that you may want to incorporate in some of your constructions as you build. Those are some of the things that we'll be exploring this evening, and to help us get a best sense of, how we can have a better understanding of green building developments and what we can perhaps expect in the future. I'm joined this evening by Mathe Mosheshoe, who is the founder of Mosheshoe Properties. Mathe, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Evening, Zama. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you, Mathe. Thank you so much for, making time for us. I think firstly, before we even go into green building, it's the first time that we're having you on the show. Perhaps share with our viewers at home a little bit about Mosheshoe Properties and the work that Mosheshoe Properties does, just so they have a good understanding of the line of work that Mosheshoe Properties is in.
All right. Mosheshoe Properties, actually, it's a company that I started in the middle of recession in 2008. And then solely when we started, my vision was just to give a good service to my people in the township, which is Katlong, where I'm coming from. And then as I continued with my entrepreneurial journey, my career actually evolved. So we started embarking into buying properties on auctions and then renovate them and flip them. And then we realized there is an opportunity to buy lands and then later develop them. And then in 2017, we then started doing business abroad, which is in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. So in a nutshell, Mosheshoe Properties is a real estate investment company. Our foundation is strictly on investment. I believe in buying and building, or buying to hold, or buy to flip. So that's more or less what I do.
And I think, one of the things with your background, Mathe, as I was, reading up and looking at the work that you've also done, is we know, of course, that there tends to not be that many women within the, property space, even within the construction space. And I think for me, one of the things that has certainly stood out is the longevity and how the company has managed to grow in different, from strength to strength, but also, of course, adding on elements, for example, of working abroad. I know that with the Dubai operation, you added that on, but still keeping the core of what you ultimately did.
Yes,
and I think this is why I want us to then get into our conversation this evening. When we look at green building developments, I know that you've got some experience from that in terms of, from the commercial perspective. when we talk about even green buildings, what exactly we're talking about? Because I think for viewers at home probably may not have quite an understanding of what we mean by green buildings. What exactly do we mean by it?
So basically, when we talk about green building, we're talking about a project which has 4 stages in it. So it starts with a design of that particular project. Then we move into construction, and then we move into operations, and then we move into implementation of that entire project. So when we talk about a design, is that when you are designing a project which you want it to be accredited or to get a rating from the Green Building Council, you have to include certain elements into your project. So we look at light, the design of your windows. We look to make sure that there's energy efficiency. We look at the kind of painting that you're going to use. You also can use your walls can also be insulated. But however, is that the nice thing about green building projects that some of them don't even have to use brick and mortar. There is a company which is called Robot Systems, whereby their methodology in terms of building is very different, whereby they only use what they call they've got some sort of how can I put it in simple English? It's sort of like a panels, and then those panels they are then covered with cement. But then in between the panel and the cement, they're then insulated, which then makes so that when it's hot, the room becomes cooler. When it's cold, like now we are in winter, the room becomes warmer, so that you don't have to use a lot of electricity during winter and by putting on heaters, and then during summer you don't have to use your air cons because then it's too hot. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about, is to preserving the environment and making sure that we don't use certain harmful materials that are actually affecting our environment, and also is to reduce transportation of certain materials to a site. So that's what we're talking about when we discuss green building.
You know, Mathe, one of the things that I've picked up when it comes to particularly green buildings, I mean, a lot of them are often commercial buildings, is oftentimes they look at a building holistically, right? So not just from the construction component and the various materials that are being used, but now when you also look at when it is essentially in use, are the lights always going to stay on? For example, we know how we often complain about in a lot of these commercial buildings, when you drive through, lights are always on, even though, let's say, on a floor, there could easily be one person. So they always now put, a lot of these new buildings, they put lights that, sensor when you walk in the bathrooms, lights go off when there's nobody in. So there are all these great mechanisms that are being put in, and we see it quite a lot in a lot of these new buildings that are in Sandton or some of the big metro areas, and it's always just so great that those small tweaks make certainly give you a better flow of a space as a person who is in that building and who's utilizing that building. I think they've even found that the costs of running that building tends to go down. The utility costs, typically go down because, as you're saying, you're often very eco-friendly, very mindful of the power supply that is needed to also run the actual building once it's up and running. I'm keen to hear from you on how South Africa ranks when we look at our green buildings. And this is still sort of within the commercial space. How do we rank against some of our counterparts abroad?
All right. I think in South Africa, we still have a long way. The green concept, actually, when I attended the course, it was back in 2010. And then we realized they were only actually launching it, if I'm correct, here in South Africa. They were establishing the Green Building Council. Whereas when you look at countries like overseas, like Australia, there are actually what they call green agents who specialize in selling houses which are green. But then when it comes to commercial, comparing to other countries, we still have a long way. Especially with us, Black people, we are not really exposed into that industry or that methodology in terms of building it. So we still have a long way to go.
Mathe, one of the things that you mentioned, and I did say to you that I want us to look into it, but and you even mentioned when you're talking about the work that Moshoeshoe Properties does, is of course how we can start implementing green building methodology or principles in residential projects. And this could easily be from, smaller scale residential projects, especially some of our viewers at home are property entrepreneurs who, do small scale developments. If we wanted to just use some of those principles, obviously, certainly the small time entrepreneurs, or we'll say new entrepreneurs, are not looking at getting accredited at this stage, but want to already start positioning themselves and making sure that the buildings that they're building right now are at that level. What are some of those things that people at home can already start doing in terms of using green building methodologies in their construction projects?
My advice firstly is to do the course with green building, because it is there, it starts there. Or maybe get in touch with a green building accredited consultant, if you can do that. But however, let's say that you don't have a budget to either go and attend a course, or you don't have a budget to be able to appoint a consultant to help you. The first thing that you need to consider when you want to integrate the methodologies of a green building in your project is to look at the lighting. Your rooms need to get as much light as possible. So it means that you will need to have maybe put bigger windows on your project. Secondly, you would like to insulate your walls. I remember when we did the project of the late O.R. Tambo, when we actually built that project, we actually didn't use any brick. We actually built it with strubles, and then we used a cow dung, mix it with lime cement. So lime cement, what it does is that it actually holds the heat when it's hot, and when it's cold, it makes the room to become warmer. So you're going to have to try to make sure that the kind of painting that you're going to use can be able to hold heat when it's too hot, and when it's cold, it can release heat. So you want to look into that. And also, I'm not promoting this company, but I think the robust structure is actually cost effective, number one. Number two, the company itself actually does designs for you for free, as long as you're going to use their material, or you're going to use their robust structure for your project. So that project, if you use the robust structure, it can actually come cost effectively, and also you can still include your concept of green building into your smaller room, back room, or whatever you want to do in the township. But it definitely starts with the design. Your design has to be able to have those components that can be able to help you to have what we call an energy efficient home. So then we come into the light. So you need to make sure the kind of light that you're using can be able to save electricity. Then we come into solar. Then we come into using what we call black water for irrigation. So instead of the water that you flush out, we can then use it maybe when you want to use it for watering your lawn. So we can actually make sure that water can still be used for other things. And then we look into tapping into getting rainwater, whereby when it's raining, we can have a JoJo tank outside that can be able to preserve water that is coming. So you don't have to use your water. And then that water can also be used for other things. You don't have to drink it. That water can be used to when you flush out your toilet. So those are the components that people can actually look into when they want to include that. And then there's a system or a calculation, which is, I think, is part of H, whereby they will then, when you do the calculation, they will tell you what you need to do to be able to have an energy efficient home.
If you've just joined us, I'm in conversation with Mathe Mosheshoe, who's the owner of Mosheshoe Properties. We're looking at the future of green building developments. And I think one of the very interesting things about green building developments, of course, and it's something that we covered here on the Private Property Podcast last year, where we saw that Baldwin Properties had gone on to launch, I think one of their new complexes that they're working on to be fully green compliant, and even looking at getting the international accreditation so that they essentially build and get the first complex in South Africa to be green compliant. It's one of those things that they were quite excited about to take to market in terms of a full-on sectional title community being the first in the country to go that route and getting accredited, which isn't the easiest route to take. It's not an easy thing to make sure that firstly you're compliant, then of course you do get your accreditation. And I'm keen to hear from you, Mathe. I mean, one of the things, of course, we know that we're not going to get to a time anytime soon where a lot of the residential buildings that we see, or a lot of the residential complexes that we see across the country that are currently being built, being fully green and accredited. I know we're very far from that. It's just not something that's going to happen. But when we look at, and as I was saying earlier, when we look at a lot of the township properties and the sort of the township property market and how so many people at home have seen the gap in the market. I know yourself as Moshoeshoe Properties have seen the gap in the market when it comes to, certainly building and being able to have quality accommodation in the townships. How can people also then ensure that they try to have their buildings as green as possible, or their developments, even though it's going to be relatively small scale? It obviously won't be as big as a Baldwin Properties, especially as somebody who's you've walked that path right now. Perhaps share some of your experience with us in terms of some of the things that you did in the development in Katlehong.
Okay, so with the development that we actually still busy with it in Katlehong, the first thing that was very important to me was the design. So I actually told my designer in terms of the kind of windows that I wanted. So the windows were quite big that when you actually in your bedrooms, there can be so much light that is coming in. So that was number one. Number two, the windows that I actually we were going to put in that project, that because obviously in the township there's a lot of noise. You wanted windows that even somebody's outside and there's music on full blast, when you are inside you still cannot hear anything. So that was very important for us to actually put on that project. And then thirdly, we also wanted to make sure that the JoJo tanks can be there so that we can actually utilize rain water to be able for gardening, for any other thing. So we actually put that on that project. And also it was the type of material, or I wouldn't say material, the type of painting that we're going to use. Certain paintings are good to be used inside the house for certain reasons, to release the heat when it has to do that, and to keep the heat when it actually needs to do that. And then that entire project is going to be built with a robot system structure, strictly robot. We're not going to use any bricks. Everything that we're going to do, it will just be panels inside that will be insulated, and then we're going to put cement. It's number one, cost effective. Number two, it's actually green building. So yeah, that's what I'm busy with on that project in Katlehong.
And Mathe, a lot of people perhaps at home might be thinking, why go the green building route? Especially because so many of us, I guess, are also just so used to bricks and mortar and the way of building that we've become accustomed to. Why go the green building route, or what benefit would people ultimately get from going that route?
I think it's about the environment, number one. Number two is trying to make sure that we move into what the whole world is moving into when it comes to construction. Number three, I think for me, the interest actually started when I did that project in Whiteville, and it was my first project of green building, and then I actually went to do the course, and I saw value in that later on I can actually get an accreditation for my project, and then it can get a rating. So that would mean that when somebody wants to sell or they want to buy into that project, we can say this is a green building accredited project. So it sort of like gives the project a value, or on its own. Just getting accreditation is value for the entire project. And also there is no green building project in any township that I know about. So that's the reason why I wanted to do that in the township, and to also bring those elements of green building and integrating in a Kasi lifestyle, whereby when somebody is make your neighbor decide to make a full blast music, you don't have to be disturbed in your own house. And also because of load shedding problems that we're having in South Africa, whereby electricity here is not here, we can be able to put certain lighting systems that even if the electricity bill is very high. That's actually my mistake. It's very high. So when we implement energy efficient methodologies, we can save on electricity. We can put solar panels, which is obviously a lot of people are doing that. The water bills are also very high. So when you want to water your garden, you don't have to use the water. You can actually use a JoJo tank, or you can use the water that is coming from the what we call dark water to water your garden.
And Mathe, I think one of the downsides to often a lot of properties, and you've just highlighted it now, is the rising utility costs. So your water and electricity bill is, continuously keeps going up. And I think in as much as a property developer or even as a landlord, that's a cost that goes to your tenant. You also want to make sure that your tenant is able to afford all the payments that they have to make towards you. So firstly, that they can pay the rental, because obviously that's what you as the landlord are banking on. And then that the cost of their water and electricity is kept as low as possible. And I think one of the things we are seeing that, the different power suppliers keep increasing tariffs, and, municipalities are also increasing their tariffs. So property entrepreneurs are also just going to have to think about how are they going to provide value for their tenants in the future, and also just try to keep their tenants' costs as low as possible. So if you're putting in solar, for example, you know that the electricity bill is at least going to go down. If you're going to have alternative ways for them to, for example, use power within the apartment, perhaps even gas, a gas stove, for example, those are certain interventions that as a property entrepreneur, you already know that you're thinking about the person who's going to be living in your property, and that they're not going to have a very high electricity bill or a very high water bill for that matter. Mathe, before I let you go, I think any tips for viewers at home who are exploring or certainly even building at home, or even are looking at doing a small development or doing a small apartments in their own backyard? Any tips for them in terms of just being very environmentally efficient, we'll call it that, or being very mindful of the impact that their construction project is going to have on the environment, and just ways that they can use better tools and just think through being as green as possible?
All right, just before I answer your question, I actually wanted to add one point which I think is very important when it comes to green building developments, is to actually making sure that there's an allocation for people who are bikers or people who are using bicycles. You will realize that most of the projects that it only has a parking bay for people who have got cars, but nobody actually, some people decide they want to have their own bikes, whereby they can use a bike to go to the mall or to go to work. So you actually can put that into your project. And then also, just for an advice to anybody who just wants to start out in their own bedroom, the first thing is that try to make sure that your design is so important in a green building project. Try to make sure that your design actually will allow you to have an energy efficient home. So your windows, you can actually capitalize on your windows. Try to have bigger windows, because then when you have bigger windows, they will bring in more light. That's number one. Number two is try to make sure that maybe on your bedrooms, the last bedroom, you can put a JoJo tank. And then with the JoJo tank, when your tenants, they want to wash their cars or they want to do anything, they don't have to use the water. They can actually just use the water from the JoJo tank. That's number two. Number three is just to make sure that the kind of painting that you're going to use, there are certain paintings which then helps you that when it's too hot, then it will absorb that heat, and then when it's too cold, it will release the heat, so that your tenant don't have to use a lot of heaters, and then because the electricity bills is very high in South Africa. And then number four is to actually make sure that if you can, those who can afford is to insulate the walls. Insulate the walls inside, because insulating the walls actually is part of a building energy efficient homes. And then it will come into your lighting, making sure the type of globes that you are using are energy efficient globes whereby they can last longer. And also there are those type of globes that when there's load shedding, automatically then they go on as if electricity is still there. So those are the things that I think anybody who's building a bedroom, they can do that. There's a project that we did in Villa Lisa, and it's actually, that's exactly what we did there.
And those are certainly great tips, Mathe. Thank you so much for sharing and, of course, joining us this evening. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Okay. Thank you.
And that is Mathe Mosheshoe, who's the owner at Mosheshoe Properties. And that brings us to the end of this evening's edition of the Private Property Podcast with myself, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. I don't leave you alone. You can catch Umbali Nwako at 8 p.m. with the Farming Podcast. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.